When we think of old Hollywood, we think of, well, this. The glamour, the elegance. Ah, a time when stars were gods and goddesses who floated above the rest of us, untouched by the gritty reality of everyday life. But that was a lie. The Golden Age wasn't magic. It was a machine, and like any machine, it had broken parts. Behind the velvet curtain, the biggest stars in the world were reckless. They were driving drunk, getting in the brawls, and waking up in beds they shouldn't have been in. In any other city, they would have gone to prison. But in Los Angeles, there was a different set of rules. If you were a star in 1935 and you committed a crime, you didn't call the police. You called the studio.
This is an emergency. Get me the studio fixer. We need him.
And the studio would send a man in a nice suit to make it all go away. They were the fixers, men who bribed judges, hid illegitimate children, and rearranged crime scenes before the cops arrived. They are the reason you still think of these actors as legends instead of criminals. This is the story of the men who buried Hollywood's bodies. To understand why a movie studio would cover up a crime, you have to understand the paperwork. In the 1930s and 40s, actors weren't just employees, they were property. When you signed with MGM, Warner Brothers, or Paramount, you signed your life away for 7 years. And buried in the fine print was the terrified actor's worst nightmare, the moral clause. This clause stated that if an actor did anything to shock, insult, or offend the community, the studio could fire them instantly. No severance, no career, nothing. But here is the catch. The studios were businesses. If MGM spent $2 million filming a movie starring Clark Gable, and Gable got arrested for a DUI halfway through filming, MGM didn't just lose an actor. They lost the $2 million. They lost the box office revenue. They lost the brand. A star like Spencer Tracy or Rock Hudson was the equivalent of a human printing press. If the press stopped working, the studio stopped making money. So, the studios were stuck in a trap of their own making. On one hand, they worked these stars to the bone, often fueling them with alcohol and pills to keep them going. They created a culture of excess and recklessness. On the other hand, they needed the public to believe these people were angels. They needed a way to bridge the gap between the messy reality of the stars' lives and the pristine image required by the moral clause. They needed an insurance policy against reality. They needed a department that didn't technically exist. The answer to that problem came in the form of two men. First, there was the muscle, Eddie Mannix. Mannix wasn't an artist. He was a former bouncer from New Jersey who worked his way up the ranks. He was the general manager of MGM, but his real job description was much darker. Mannix was rumored to have deep ties to organized crime. He was the guy you called at 3 a.m. when there was a body on the floor or a car wrapped around a tree. He didn't care about publicity, he cared about evidence. His job was to get to the scene, bribe the witnesses, and make sure the physical proof disappeared before the flashbulbs went off. Then there was the spin, Howard Strickling. Strickling was the head of publicity at MGM. If Mannix was the bad cop, Strickling was the good cop. He was the one the stars trusted. He was a father figure who listened to their secrets. Together, they formed an iron curtain around the studio. It worked like this. If a star got into trouble, Mannix handled the reality. He'd pay off the police chief or send the star to a private hospital to dry out. Then, Strickling handled the fiction. He would type up a press release saying the star was vacationing in Europe or recovering from exhaustion. Their power was absolute. In the 1930s, the LAPD often didn't even report crimes involving MGM stars to the station. They called the studio first. They would ask Mannix, "How do you want us to write this up?" These two men successfully suppressed hundreds of scandals. Assaults became accidents, overdoses became allergic reactions, and illegitimate children became nieces and nephews. But to really understand how they operated, we have to look at the specific files they tried to burn. To understand just how much power Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling wielded, we have to look at the case files. These aren't rumors. These are documented events where reality was rewritten to save the studio's bottom line. In 1935, Clark Gable and Loretta Young were filming Call of the Wild. Gable was the married king of Hollywood. Young was a devout Catholic. They had an affair, and Young became pregnant. In today's world, this is a tabloid scandal. In 1935, it was a career death sentence. Because of the moral clause, Young would have been fired and blacklisted for having a child out of wedlock. Enter the fixers. Mannix and Strickling devised a plan that sounds like a soap opera plot. They sent Loretta Young into hiding in Europe for exhaustion. She secretly gave birth in a rented house. But here is the crazy part. They put the baby in an orphanage. Loretta Young then returned to Hollywood, waited a few months, and publicly announced she was adopting a child. She adopted her own biological daughter. The secret was kept for decades, even though everyone in Hollywood whispered about it. Why? Because the little girl had Clark Gable's unmistakable ears. The studio didn't just fix a scandal, they created a fake life for a human being. If the first case was a drama, this one is a noir thriller. In 1932, Jean Harlow, the blonde bombshell, was MGM's biggest sex symbol. She was married to a producer named Paul Bern. 2 months into their marriage, Bern was found in their bedroom. He was nude, sprawled in front of a mirror with a devastating wound. The butler found the body, but he didn't call the police. He called the studio. Eddie Mannix arrived at the crime scene hours before the cops. Rumors have swirled for nearly a century about what Mannix did in that room. Did he rearrange the body? Did he destroy evidence? We know Mannix found evidence that alluded to Burns' humiliation. Mannix then handed it over to the police, ensuring the ruling went one way and not the other. A controlled situation. By the time the detectives arrived, the scene had been managed. Jean Harlow was protected from a murder investigation, and the studio kept their star shining, even if the truth about Paul Bern's death died with him. If the first 2 cases were about hiding a specific event, this next case was about hiding an entire lifestyle. Spencer Tracy was the father of America. On screen, he was reliable, decent, and moral. But off-screen, he was a violent alcoholic who would vanish for days at a time. He was such a liability that Eddie Mannix created a special task force known as the Tracy Squad. This was a team of security guards and doctors who were on call 24/7, specifically for Spencer. When Tracy went on a bender, he would often tear apart bars, start brawls, and get thrown in jail. The Tracy Squad would intercept the police calls, rush to the bar, and physically carry him out the back door before the press arrived. They would drive him to a private studio hospital to detox, while Howard Strickling released statements saying Tracy was suffering from a virus or exhaustion. Once, Tracy was arrested for kicking a police officer. Mannix didn't just bail him out, he allegedly bribed the sheriff to wipe the arrest record entirely. For 20 years, the public thought Spencer Tracy was a saint. In reality, he was a man constantly on the run from his own demons, with Eddie Mannix chasing right behind him to clean up the mess. For 30 years, Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling held the keys to the kingdom. They decided what was true and what was fiction. But like all empires, the studio system eventually crumbled. In the 1950s, 2 things happened that killed the era of the fixer. First, the Supreme Court broke up the studio monopolies, meaning actors were no longer owned property. They became freelancers. Second, the tabloids arrived. Magazines like Confidential started paying waiters, maids, and chauffeurs for dirt. The fixers could bribe a police chief, but they couldn't bribe every bartender in Los Angeles. The wall of silence was breached. Eddie Mannix stayed at MGM until his death in 1963. By then, the golden age was over. The carefully curated gods and goddesses of the screen were replaced by celebrities who were messy, human, and constantly being watched. Looking back, we have to ask ourselves, was the golden age of Hollywood actually golden? Or was it just a very expensive coat of paint applied by men like Mannix to cover up the rot? They protected the stars from the consequences of their actions, but in doing so, They often trap them in a prison of perfection. Today, we have publicists and crisis management firms, but the raw, unchecked power of the studio fixer is gone. Or is it? Do you think a modern version of Eddie Mannix is still operating in Hollywood today? Or has the internet made secrets impossible to keep? Let me know your theory in the comments below.